Hey, YouTube. So first things first, I only give money to two YouTubers, like subscription-wise, and one of them here is the Little Platoon. That is a dude from the UK that does movie reviews. It's a little bit fandom menacey, but it is absolutely fantastic. So before I get started with my abortion video here, just want to give a shout out to that dude. He's pretty damn good at what he does. So, right out the gates, I want to start by saying this video about abortion is not to tell you how to think about the subject. I'm not going to try to change your mind. I'm not going to try to make you pro-choice or pro-life. I'm not going to slam one side of the argument. The intention of this video is to elevate the discourse and kind of shed a lot of the rhetoric that I think makes up a lot of the bad arguments in this particular debate. The goal here is to get down to where the actual disagreement tends to be when people debate this topic, and hopefully just kind of help everybody push their arguments forward to the next level. It's best to remember in this video, we are a nation of laws, and there's no fundamental code written into our nation on the topic of abortion. It's the privacy standard, and I don't want to get into all that. There's a lot of people that are better equipped, legally minded, to explain that to you, but the standard of expectation of privacy is somewhat justified by the Bill of Rights and particular readings of particular amendments and precedent. So I'm going to just accept that that's a thing and move forward from there. If you debate it, not the place or time for that. Take it to a legal argument place, because I'm not smart enough in law to be making those particular arguments. I'm not going to be making any moral judgments about either side as well. I'm not going to say it's bad to kill all babies or it's bad to imprison women and force them to carry babies to term. I'm going to judge those arguments, but I'm not going to make them myself. I'm here to look at the mechanics of the argument, try to boil it down to a base level, what I would call the non-loaded term sophistry. You've heard that in the past, and it's mostly a pejorative used against people that are good at debate, but not really well-meaning, well-intended. They obfuscate, they use debate tactics, and I'm actually going to include an example of that in here. Somebody I think is a sophist, but please try not to identify with your view here. Even if you do, use this to hopefully better plan out your counter arguments in the future. But really, I'd like for people just to hear out these arguments in their base form from somebody that doesn't essentially side with them. I'm just trying to give the best version of those arguments. I want to start, as always, by clearing up some definitions and providing a framework for the video. The body of the video is where I'm actually going to dig into the arguments. And at one point, I'm going to sneak in the old YouTube rebuttal to another YouTuber, because the idea of making this video actually came from listening to several debates about abortion, but the most recent one was one YouTuber against two women on the Whatever podcast debating abortion for over 4 hours, and there is zero obligation to watch any of these debates, particularly the one I'm going to respond to. You can if you want, to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anybody's views, but I really feel like it was a toxic, angry debate where if they would have shed all that emotion and the bickering, they only got about half an hour's worth of actual good conversation in that 4.5 hours. It's not worth the time for you to sift through that bullshit when I've already done it and I can relay it to you. So I don't judge these arguments based on how good the presenter was in the debates that I watched either. The pro-choice debater in the example I'm going to use in the video is much better with his mastery of arguments and sophistry, and despite being less educated on most topics that he actually debates about, he tends to win more arguments than not, because he's so good at the mastery of an argument, at taking in new information, putting it through his process, and coming out with a result that actually holds up. And that skill of sophistry pushes this particular individual forward in a way that the merits of his actual knowledge wouldn't normally if they were. My point is, Destiny's very good at debate, and that's why he wins debate, not so much because he has the right point or more education on the topic. So I really think that As the pro-life side gained their bearings a little bit toward the end of the conversation, they really started asking the right questions and digging down to the core argument. And it ended up just being an argument based on definitions at the end of the day. And I really feel like their definition is just objectively better. I'm going to get into all that. So stand back, stand by. We're diving in. First, we're going to start with defining some terms. I got to generalize a bit here, so I'm going to leave some things intentionally vague in order to... There's a lot of views on abortion. It's potentially each view on abortion could be individualized to each particular person and have slight variance to everyone else under their camp. So I tried to break down the abortion stances into three camps: pro-life, pro-choice moderate, and pro-choice, I wrote here extremist, but that word's loaded. There's a lot of loaded words. Absolutionist is another one I like, but there's a loaded meaning behind that brings in even more. And I'm not trying to slander the extreme pro-choice people by throwing those words in there. I don't have a better term for it. So if you have one, like, that's not as loaded as absolutionist or extremist to define people that are on one very far end of the abortion issue, I am all ears. I just lack that particular vocabulary. Pro-life. So we're going to start with this definition. Human beings start at conception. Parenthood is implied since that organism has the blueprint, or personhood is implied, because that organism has a biological blueprint to grow into a human if unhindered and left to the natural process. All rights kick in at that point of conception. And that's the general definition. Now, how extreme somebody in this camp is, what they believe, I'm going to actually get into some Gallup polling at the end of the video to show that pro-life isn't as absolute as it sounds. There's a lot of different caveats people give. Rape, incest, life of the mother, and such for some people that are pro-life. Others say that that's a bad... I actually say that the rape one is a bad argument, but I'll get to that. Definition number 2, pro-choice moderate. Generally pro-choice with some to many exceptions, but they find themselves generally accepting legalized abortion between 12 and 24 weeks, roughly, for a multitude of reasons, and then only for medical uses after that. For this view, it is that human rights kick in as soon as a particular criteria or factor is met. There's a lot of factors like personhood, sentience, viability outside of the mother, or whatever criteria that you see this fetus crossing over a certain threshold to be deemed worthy of fundamental human rights. I'm trying to represent this as well as I can and as broadly as I can, but still be specific enough so you know what I'm talking about. This is probably the most diverse group of the three in the pack, and it's probably the most Big Tent definition I'm going to give of the three, because we see people who justify less loaded forms of eugenics with this particular, like with Iceland aborting all their Down syndrome babies. That's technically eugenics, but it's also not as loaded as like racial eugenics and whatnot. We also see others that deem their criteria as absolute. The person who I will call out in this segment is making the argument that despite potential and the natural process that fetus will eventually develop what they consider personhood, the fact that they don't have it in that exact moment means that they don't have those rights. I really want to stick to my notes here, because if I ramble about this, I'll say something incorrect. If that fetus doesn't have the capability of personhood in that very moment, they are equal to a body who has been declared deceased because that personhood from brain function has ceased. This has very little to do with the viability standard, but they do fall under the same tent. So again, it's a generalization. That's the particular argument I dive into the most, is the personhood argument. Actually, I have one citation in this entire video, and it's going to be around that. Just because, again, I'm going to be kind of critiquing somebody's stance on that. Pro-choice absolutionist. Again, I'm sorry for the loaded word. I don't mean it to have any more connotation than they're just extreme in the pro-choice side. The movement is that the rights of the mother over her own body are absolute, and the fetus/baby has zero rights until it's no longer dependent on the mother's body. By nature of the third group, viability is not a factor. The choice goes to the mother and her consent primarily. If she does not want to go through the process of having a viable baby removed at 22 weeks, then she can abort it. She can abort up to the day of death, or up to the day of birth if she wants. And in some cases, if the baby survives, essentially killing the baby after birth. That was the law in Virginia that was debated for a while and whatnot. Celebrate Your Abortion movements kind of come out of this, and anyone that's watched like 2015 anti-feminist YouTube knows this group that praises abortions, that doesn't see it as safe, legal, and rare, but something to be proud of, and women's rights and blah, blah, blah. So those are the three categories. I would say 80 to 90% of people fall into these camps and will be at least accept the general definitions I gave for their big three camps. If you don't, then you can shut the hell up because I don't care. Now let's move on to the next point, which is a hybrid between defining terms and clearing up bad arguments. So it's a little bit of foreshadowing to the body of the video while also incorporating what I just started to do with definitions and a little taste of what to come, a little sample of Papa's goodies, if you will. So naming conventions, pro-life and pro-choice, are just shorthand labels for an argument. You'll hear a lot of people, pro-lifers, pro-choicers, you say you're pro-life, but you don't support Medicare for all. So that means you're not pro-life. Well, these terms are basically just shorthand for your stance on abortion. It's a good way to take 5 minutes worth of conversation and pack it into a 2-second statement. Pro-life means you are against legal abortion to some degree, if not absolutely. Not that you need to support every position, the life side of every position. There is a good argument to be in favor of the death penalty, but also be anti-abortion. You don't have to be pro-life across the board to be pro-life on the issue of abortion. Same thing with pro-choice. It's more of a nebulous term around the pro-legal abortion argument and not a stance for all of your political options. Like, if you're pro-choice, that doesn't mean that you can be against heavy, strict regulations against tobacco and advertising to children. You know, it's a choice. Kids have a choice to smoke tobacco. It's a dumb argument. Pro-choice just is shorthand for your abortion stance. And again, it's very nebulous because pro-choice is really a big term. All right, these terms just exist to Yep. Finally, we're making our way to the body of the video, the meat and potatoes. I only have 5 categories of argument in which I sampled from various debates, social media, and all over the place. Now I want to get into some of these arguments. I just grabbed a handful of the popular ones. I tried to take ones that are similar and be a little more general so I could pack different arguments in the same boat. So just work with me a little bit here. I did leave out some details intentionally so I could try to cover as broad of a plethora of different arguments as I could. So we're going to start with pro-legal abortion arguments I hate. And this will be the start of actually covering some of these arguments. So we're going to talk first about some of the low-hanging fruit here, and it's going to be the autonomy argument. The women's ability to choose what to do with their bodies. This argument, you want to control women, you think women are subservient, right-wingers think that women are... I hate this argument. Every single law restricts the autonomy of somebody. Most laws restrict the autonomy of everybody, but some are made sometimes, especially in the past, specific to different groups. A clear example of this would be before the year of 1992 in the UK, the rape law was something that only men could be guilty of because it involved penetration. And before that law was changed a few years back, that's a great example of a law just jurisdicting one particular group around the subject of sex. There's other laws, but, you know, that's just giving you some context here. Each law, as a result of the law or its unintentional consequences, will probably see discrimination and application for multiple different reasons, and just pointing out that one side is affected drastically more or one group is affected more doesn't actually get to the heart of the argument being made. It instead tries to overrule it with selection bias arguments based on results. It often boils down to, why doesn't the mother deserve more rights to the baby? And I'm being very crass with these arguments. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but that's like the underlying argument there. Why doesn't the mother deserve more rights than the baby? And I'll get to that in a little bit of a different section, but if you need to use a completely different argument to defend this argument, then this argument sucks, and maybe the other argument is better. It's actually going to be in one of the pro-legal abortion arguments I like. So the autonomy argument, I'm giving that one a C- on the tier list, I guess, or whatever. It's just not that good. There are circumstances I can think of where this argument is valid, though. So I won't say it's completely useless to not bring this up, but this is not a good argument to justify making abortion legal and that pro-lifers are wrong and debunked. Now, only 1% of abortions are in the third trimester, so why are you worried? It's very rare. Well, this is going to be a data-driven point. 1% of abortions last year could be anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 in that year. So it's a small percentage, yes, but 9,000 is a pretty large number. Let's give you some other numbers people that are pro-abortion may be outraged by. How many kids were shot by a crazy active shooter in school? Not like a gang-related mass shooting or shooting at school or whatever, but like somebody with an AR-15 that walks in and starts picking off kids. So between the ages of 1 to 14, I looked up some FBI data here. It's roughly about 5 kids a year over the 2000 to 2019 period. It's about 5.4 kids a year that are shot in school by some crazy ideological or schizophrenic or whatever gunman. And again, I'm trying to narrow that down. What we consider an active shooter event, what we consider like a mass shooter in terms of like Columbine and Uvalde and those. That's the kind of mass shooter I'm talking about. So 5 kids a year versus 6,000 to 9,000 third trimester abortions. Unarmed black people shot by the police. This is a huge topic for people on the left. It's like 10 to 30 a year. Another one is the trans genocide point. Trans people are one of the most targeted groups per capita to be murdered for their identity. I think the highest year on record was 29, but I didn't look that up. I'm just kind of giving you some examples and numbers here. So let's just say it's less than 100 a year to be safe. Less than 100 versus 9,000. So no, I'm not minimalizing any of these things. I'm not trying to say it's good that 26 black people were unarmed shot by police this year. Not doing any of that. What I'm saying is, if you're going to worry about the number 26 and then tell us that we shouldn't worry about the number 9,000, it slaps your own argument in the face, essentially. I've seen enough anecdotal evidence personally to know that there are at least some third trimester abortions that don't involve rape, incest, or life of the mother. So even if it's rare, you can't just shrug it off and say it's a small number, just not worry about it, because it's just it sounds what's the word? Heartless, essentially, to somebody who thinks abortion is murder, and it actually hurts your side a little bit. I have seen a lot of anecdotal data on this, but the data is shit for third trimester abortions. I don't want to cite it. I'm making an argument less fact-based, and I'm not going to use a data-driven argument because, again, the data is shit. I've seen some exit polling data on third trimester abortions. I just don't think it gives a clear enough picture, so I don't want to use it. The fetus is just a clump of cells that deserves to die. That's the next argument I want to take down. If you want to cherry pick that single factor, everyone's just a clump of cells, and that's really as simple as it gets. Like pointing to a fetus and saying it's just a clump of cells, I'd point back to you and say you're just a clump of cells. So it makes you worthy of human rights. Every single living being can be reduced down to that. You care about animals, you care about fur, well, they're just a clump of cells. Like, I should be able to kill them and wear their skin and eat them. They're just a clump of cells, right? So it kind of just talks past the point. You see how using the same reductivist tactic really just doesn't help anybody's point or drive the conversation forward. So the last major low-hanging fruit argument I want to get to here is you don't get to just say an argument. You aren't a woman. You aren't a doctor. You don't have kids. You aren't paying this particular thing. You aren't paying for the abortion. You don't get to have a say in it. Your opinion's not valid. Your views are omitted because you don't meet a specific criteria. I just want to ask, what other issues do we do that for? Are there any? Do we have the people that pay the highest percentage of tax have the biggest say in tax laws? Do the people that own the guns make the gun legislation, and everyone that doesn't own a gun has to sit it out. Can only the people that have done drugs make drug laws, and et cetera, et cetera. I'd say it's just not smart as an argument tactic. If you think abortion is murder, if you think ending a child's life in the womb at 2 weeks is killing another human being, you're arguing for the morality of your society. So it doesn't matter if you're not a woman in particular. The argument is bigger than that, and you're not addressing their point. I would say that argument is probably the lowest tier pro-life argument that I've seen. There's no good point that can come out of it. I can't see a single circumstance where that beats any argument. It's a conversation ender. So from here, this whole page that I have written down here is going to be the response part to Destiny. I'm going to leave a comment in the description to get you specifically to this part in case the dude actually sees this and wants to see why his argument's dog shit. So if you don't know who Destiny is, that's okay. This is still just another argument that I dislike that I'm going to kind of debunk. I'm just going to do this one with a little bit more of a thorough analysis. So I started out watching this 4-hour debate on Destiny's side. One, because I think he, at the end of the day, is an honest person. He at least tries to be. He tries his best. I respect qualities of his personality. And on top of that, he's just a much more likable guy. And these two women come off, especially the larger woman, come off as very, very unlikable at the beginning. And the woman on the right, the larger one, it stays unlikable all the way up to the end. I was cheering for her to lose. The argument here is he is ignoring nature, ignoring potential, ignoring that if something is left to his own devices in the natural system, the natural way things are, that organism will grow into a baby. But if it doesn't have the parts of the brain at that very moment to have what he calls personhood, then it's not worthy of any human rights. So I'm trying to steelman his argument here in that he's saying that at a certain time, anywhere from 18 to 24 weeks, a certain part of your brain develops in this process that gives you the ability to have personhood. And I'll get into personhood with my NIH citation because they actually talk about this a bit more. But from here, he's saying if somebody hasn't hit that threshold yet of personhood, their human rights have not yet kicked in. Which I would say he'd agree with that argument. That's kind of what he's saying, essentially boiled down. The justification for this is Destiny came to the conclusion that when he talks about a person, he's talking about the identity inside the brain and not just the mech meat suit that is our body. We take a snapshot in time right now, ignoring potential and nature. And if the body doesn't have X criteria right now, it is not worthy yet of that full slew of basic human rights. This is a single factor analysis on advanced brain, I don't want to say waves, advanced brain functions. I guess. I don't know how to say it properly. Personhood, let's just go with that. This is a single factor analysis on personhood and if having access to personhood in that moment, absent of drugs or a medical issue or being asleep, if that person doesn't have access to personhood in that very moment, they're technically not alive. Again, if I said any loaded words in here, I'm really trying to be as charitable as I can to Destiny's stance here. I think I did that. So I want to give my weaker what-if argument first, just to kind of question the premise of his argument. He's using this single factor of if a person has the ability to demonstrate personhood, that makes them worthy of human rights. So he uses we judge death by the lack of a higher brain function. And so if a baby doesn't have that higher brain function yet, he is not technically yet alive, or it is not technically yet alive. So he's using the same factor. But if a doctor told me that we judge the beginning of a cycle based on X factor and the end of a cycle based on Y factor, and gave me the criteria for that, I'd find that perfectly reasonable. Destiny's assuming that the beginning and end of any particular cycle needs to be judged by the exact same factor. I can think of different things scientifically to debunk that, but I'm not a scientist, so maybe I can defer to somebody else. But again, this would be if he gave me any pushback on this. So there could be a need to ask somebody in a medical field. I feel that this is a weak argument, but in terms of argument mechanics, it's still valid. Destiny's argument somewhat takes a poor paraphrase of science and then applies it, okay. So yeah, I'm saying this is a weak argument, but it applies because the mechanic he is using here, again, is to judge everything from a single factor using what he determines to be what we judge death on. So he says we judge death on higher brain function. So for baby, I already explained that. I hope if he watches this, he says that that's a good paraphrase, because I really did try here, man. Sorry if not, but now that being said, there wasn't toxicity and yelling and a lot of non-adult-like behavior, and it really only got about 30 minutes worth of actual good debate, and the women were both weaker debaters for sure, but they eventually did kind of crack into what I see to be the argument that busts his point wide open. And when they actually started asking these questions, I had to pause the video and really start thinking about what they were saying more, because they weren't doing it. And I actually ended up switching sides in the debate to say that Destiny's argument that I was thinking about even potentially adopting as my own was wrong. Or not wrong, just maybe not as strong as he thought. So first off, the standard of death is not the ceasing of higher brain functions, and death can occur without that happening. So this is where I'm actually going to bring in my one citation here. And it's more just to be thorough. So we're going to talk about the total brain standard here. This is the total brain death standard. This is a history here of the definition of death. It starts out with the early definitions that were heart and lung, and how those weren't great. And it talks about some legal issues. Then we get to the total brain standard, and I want to you can read about it. I encourage you to read this. I read this whole citation. I learned a ton, and it's great. But anywho, while total brain functions may not be necessary for death, it may be sufficient in the sense that all cases of total brain death are the cause of death. The reverse statement that all cases of death are caused by total brain death is thus not addressed. So it's basically saying that the standard of death is not just brain death. Brain death is one of the standards of death, but in here it explains that brain death is sufficient for sure, but you can die and still not have total brain death occur. Your brain could be fully functioning when you're dead, and it's just you ran out of blood. So heart and lungs are two other factors. Now, I kind of going to get into the ramifications of that using Destiny's actual logic here. Also, just to be fair, the higher brain standard also exists. I'm not going to talk about that, but that is not total brain death. That's just the parts of the brain that describe the personal identity or your personhood. And this is kind of what Destiny talks about. I really think that would be a much more interesting conversation to have with somebody. And I just don't think those ladies are smart enough to have that with him. He is a smart dude. That's why he's able to win debates when he doesn't actually know what the fuck he's talking about. He's a very smart person. So, smart in that he's able to figure things out well, logically intelligent, I guess. People feel free to read more of on the standard and whatnot. I just needed that one cherry-picked part to show you that brain function is one of the standards of death, but not the only one. And Destiny is saying in this debate that is the only standard of death, and thus we should base that as the standard of life as well. So after that misreading on how brain death is just one of the standards of death, we can get into implications. The heart and lung standards are still sometimes used as a standard of death. And so that would mean that by Destiny's logic, if you use those two things as the standard of death, then the heartbeat law would be valid, or once the baby draws its first breath inside the womb, those would also be valid metrics of when personhood starts, because those are valid metrics of when we determine somebody's dead. Our heart, lungs, and brain function. So I don't think he really thought that through that much, and the reason why is because he's insisting on this definition that brain function is the only standard of death, and it's not. Again, you can take a look at this if you think I'm not telling the truth, but I really highlighted the part that I think really kind of sets that aside. Anyways, another way we could alter the framing actually occurs in the debate itself. The women are using Destiny's same standard, but using the dictionary definition of the standard, which involves the word cease. Now, in a debate about definitions, when he's defining the term death and using that as like the cornerstone of his argument, and they're defining death as something different, and he tells them that they're hung up on particular words and their definition isn't right and his is right, and that's why his argument's right. That's all this is just they're debating definitions. So then he talks about how cringe it is to use the dictionary and use official definitions in a debate about definitions. That's like saying it's cringe to use citation in a debate about facts. Like, if you're talking about definitions, using official definitions is probably the best source of information. Now, I do get what he says when he says using textbook definitions is kind of cringe sometimes. There are circumstances where I completely agree with him. But in this, when you're having a debate about definitions, this is not one of them. So, he keeps telling them they're caught up on the word cease. But the dictionary definition of death is that you had brain functions at one point and then they ceased in a way that they're not coming back. And the women use this definition, and I objectively think this definition is better because of the fact that it encompasses all the exceptions Destiny had to make in his definition. His definition of personhood is the ceasing of brain functions, except when you're sleeping, except when you're on drugs, except when you're on anesthesia, things like that. Whereas their definition actually covers those exceptions in the definition. So just based on how definitions work and giving them a grade, their definition is objectively more inclusive, and thus I feel like their definition is objectively better to define death, and their definition also works to justify their point about personhood in babies, speaking to the potential and the nature of that two-cell organism if left alone. One final argument, and I actually have a couple more arguments. Before I get into this last one here, I want to double down about this nature point because I don't feel like I've really talked about it to its full extent. Nature in this the equation is left out here of Destiny's single factor analysis, where death and life are part of nature. They're fashioned by nature. The human body is tailored by nature. Pregnancy comes from natural evolution. So nature is an important component in this argument, and you can't just ignore it and take a snapshot and ignore the nature of what birth is versus its exact opposite, which is death. He says death and birth are functionally the same thing, so they should have the same standard of criteria, where I would argue they're exact opposites. And just because they have similarities, like a coin, both sides have similarities, but they are two opposite sides of a coin. And that's why death and life are similar, but I think, again, they're exact opposites, where he's saying that they're so similar we should judge them to the same criteria. I don't think there's anything to back Destiny's stance here. You can go through, I'll get to that in a second. So who is being harmed here? If a person, this is one of the counterpoints the women make, and I feel like this is one of the few good points that they actually make in the video. Who is being harmed? Well, if a baby feels pain long before it's registered in higher brain functions, I think pain was 12 weeks. It's not important, but it's just long before Destiny's standard of personhood. So if the baby still feels pain, who's actually being hurt here is the baby. It just doesn't register what that pain is. It's still feeling it. It's still suffering. It's still burning the flies off of a wing the flies off of a fly. Burning the wings off of a fly. So why does that matter in a personhood? If the harm you're preventing, why does it matter if the person preventing the harm is preventing the harm to themselves or a defenseless baby. This is one of the counter questions Destiny asked. Why does it matter who's being hurt by this abortion if the baby isn't even sentient? And it's kind of a dumb question that kind of attacks their motive more than anything and doesn't actually address the debate. And I would say, does it matter if you're standing up for yourself or somebody that's defenseless? Like, if a woman's being raped, it's like, oh, I'm not being hurt by that, so the baby is who's being hurt, and someone standing up for it, it's virtuous. You can agree with that or disagree, but that's kind of like what their point is. So. All right, and at one point he's pressed about the mother taking drugs when her child is only 10 weeks pregnant. And no, she's pregnant is the criteria for this part of the conversation. She's well aware she's pregnant. She's planning on having an abortion. She takes drugs. Should that be illegal? And his argument basically boils down to, if she's planning on getting an abortion, who gives a fuck? Let her do drugs the entire time she's pregnant. She's going to kill that thing off anyways. It's not going to matter. But if she plans on keeping the baby, then she should be criminally prosecuted for the drugs she did before 20 weeks. And really, this is kind of the magic vagina theory at the end of the day. If the intent of what that clump of cells is going to become based on the mother should jurisdict her legal future, then shouldn't it also jurisdict the baby's legal future as well? Let me break that down in more simple words. So Destiny says that if the woman's planning on having the baby and does drugs while she's pregnant, she should be charged with harming the baby, even if it's before that 20-week threshold, because of her intent of what to do with that baby. So the woman's legal future is based on her actions, even though that thing inside her doesn't have personhood, just because of the intent of the mother. So if the mother intends to abort, that thing's not a person. If the mother doesn't intend to abort, it is a person. That's essentially his argument. And it's not in the moment, but I mean, he's saying that, like, if a mother does drugs at 10 weeks and the baby, she's not planning on getting rid of the baby, then that should be illegal. So I kind of feel like this debunks his point a little bit, but a little bit. I feel like if I brought this nitpick up to him, he could probably just recalibrate his argument a little bit to consider my point here. So I don't think this is like a conversation destroyer or anything. It's just a pretty solid side point. The follow-up video to this debate, Destiny gets an email from one of his fans, and oh man, this made me cringe. This was the worst point. And I'm really glad. He's like, I can't believe I didn't do this during the debate. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm really glad you didn't do this during the debate, actually, because it's stupid. So he gets an email from a fan, and the fan's like, here's why. They're talking about the standard of the baby not having personhood, or the ability to show personhood in that moment, and why that whole blueprint argument is bad. And instead of actually saying why, all they do is just paraphrase to other comparisons and talk about how those comparisons don't work. So if those comparisons over there don't work, then obviously this one doesn't as well. Checkmate, atheists. It's just the worst low tier argument. It's a sophistry game that they're trying to debunk an argument by not debunking the argument. They're just pulling out one feature of the argument, ignoring the rest, debunking that one feature, and trying to plug it back in already debunked. So one of the points brought up is like, I'm 12 years old now, but I'm going to be 16. So give me my license now because I'm 12, because eventually I will be 16. And it's like, yeah, you're right about that point, but I can go find you a list of situations like one that's brought up as a super chat in the debate. So somebody super chats in, if you have a cake in the oven, but it's not done baking yet, a Bill Burr joke actually. If your cake's in the oven, someone comes and grabs your cake out of the oven, dumps the batter all over the floor, you're not going to say, oh, my cake batter. You're going to say, oh, my cake. And Destiny hears this during the debate and laughs at it. It's a stupid, ridiculous example because the subject they're talking about is much more complicated than that. And he's 100% right when he says that. But then he goes and does the exact same thing when people give stupid, boiled down, simplistic examples on his personal stream. And it's just such a brainlet move. Oh, man. Yeah, again, I could go compile a list of situations where the examples side with the woman and not Destiny, and just because I compiled that list doesn't mean one side is correct and one side isn't. It's so dumb. It's such a low-tier argument that I thought was beneath this dude. I feel like he I'm happy he didn't say that at the actual debate, because it would have embarrassed him even more than his argument did. So those are all the pro-choice arguments that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm going to get into a couple, and again, that's the largest section of the video. I'm going to get into pro-legal abortion arguments that I like. So one of them brought up during this last debate here is the developmental discrimination argument. Currently in society, your rights don't fully mature until adulthood, and you have the mental capacity or maturity enough to correctly understand the ramifications of those rights. You don't get to drive until you're 18, or own a gun until you're 18, or join the army until you've reached adulthood. Some privileges and whatnot in society, like drinking, I guess you don't have the right to drink, but you have the privilege to drink. That's even limited more, and can be limited by your up to 21 or 25 to rent a car or whatnot. And sometimes words or actions you say and do will limit other things you can have in society. Like if you say you're going to kill your wife and you don't actually follow through on it, it's just a threat, there could be some states that won't let you get a gun as easily or something like that. So we do have restriction of rights in our country, and as well for children. Children can't sign a contract, so their parent or guardian has to usually sign consent forms and contracts for them. So for us to argue that an unborn human doesn't have the same rights as an adult female is not the worst argument in the world, because we already have that degradation of rights based on age, based on factors like age and other factors as well, but based on age specifically here. A child cannot sign a contract, they need a parent or guardian to do it for them, they can't vote, they can't drive, and many other things, just because they are a child. So on this level, I would say that is a very strong argument legally to point out that abortion doesn't really violate rights in some particular fashion. It's not going to win anyone over to your side, but it is still a solid argument for your side. Another argument I like, there is no way you can make abortion legal and not charge the mother for being complicit in murder or involuntary manslaughter or whatnot. Like, if a mother gets drunk and her baby dies and she's not even aware she's pregnant, that's arguably involuntary manslaughter, isn't it? Or some harm to a child, even if it was unintentional. Like, it'd be like having your kid in the back seat without a seatbelt on and getting in an accident and the kid flies through the window and dies. It's not like you meant to harm the kid. It just wasn't, the child's protection wasn't forefront. So I don't know what the law would be around that, but I'm pretty sure that's a pretty solid point. So here is also where I initially had my point. I am not going to include my stance on abortion. I think for me to make this video, I need to try to remain 10,000 feet up from the subject and not bring my personal views into it. If you listen to the intro, there is a word I said multiple times that I'm not actually going to bring up in any of these 5 categories here. And if you're observant, you'll probably be able to just figure out my stance from that. But if if Destiny hears this, I will give him my stance and full argument behind abortion, so we're on equal footing. If he ever wanted to do some sort of response to me, I don't want to have an advantage over this dude and have to have him speak in hypotheticals. I have heard him address different forms of my argument in the past. Some of them well, some of them not so well, but I just, at the end of the day here, his argument's at least equally as dog shit as mine, if he can show me my argument's dog shit. So, anti-legal abortion arguments that I hate. History shows us that not giving human rights to people will lead to the Nazis, or some version of eugenics, or if we don't give the full scale of human rights to everybody, bad things happen in the past, and we need to not do that anymore. And this is just pure fear-mongering, and I don't like it at all. I don't like it for justification against Putin, thinking if we don't stop him, he's going to become the next Hitler. It's just a bad argument. It's a slippery slope argument, and it's fear-mongering. So this is fear-mongering based on past results. And second, we already practice minor forms of eugenics today. some places much more like aborting babies with mental disabilities in Iceland. Fear mongering is not a reason to not do policies. And in cases where those fears are justified, we just account for them. And if they're not justified, we brush them off. And this is what the debate process is for. If conservatives said, I don't like abortion, but this is what the people want, and let's find a way to meet in the middle, this is something that would probably be shed out of the argument, but because they would put policies in place to make sure it's not the Nazis. So why do legislators get to choose who lives or dies is another argument. Why do legislators... This is kind of the pro-life version of the autonomy argument, also with you're not a doctor. This is a choice between a woman and her doctor. This is actually what politicians and legislators do, is they make policy, healthcare policy, policy about all sorts of things. When they make a policy regarding tariffs, they're making policy that has massive implications on the economy. When they're making policy about war, they have massive implications over people's lives in the military. When they make policies about healthcare, their policy decides essentially who lives or dies in many ways. And in ways, the consequences from their policy will see treatment preferences based on age and severity of the illness and other factors that will lead to death. Income in the United States, a lot of your, not a lot, I don't know how to say this without shitting on I like the U.S. healthcare system, so I don't want to shit on it, but in the U.S., your health is somewhat dependent on your personal wealth. So the more money you have, the more you can access one of the greatest healthcare systems in the history of man. And if you don't have that money, then you find the system to be lacking for you. So when politicians make traffic policy, their policy could result in death, even if they made well-meaning traffic laws. So this is why being a legislator is actually a harder and more impactful job than people think, because every policy they make could result in death, and that would be on their hands every time. So, I mean, it already happens. Legislators already get to kind of choose who lives or dies indirectly. I could also squint a little and bring self-defense laws into this counter-argument as well. It wouldn't be one-to-one, but allowing self-defense arguments would essentially be legislators choosing who gets to live or die as well. So allowing the death sentence and all sorts of things, or politicians kind of either directly or indirectly choosing if people live or die. So I don't think this is a good point, because that's literally what they do. If both sides are wrong, this was something I've actually never heard this argument before, and I heard it in the 4-hour bickering debate. If both sides are wrong, the consequences of the pro-choice side are much worse than the consequences of the pro-life side. And I say that is absolutely correct. So what? So what? Destiny goes into like game theory argument, which I think is like a non-answer. It's like a politician answer. Well, I need to know what the risk factor is here or there. It's like, bro, just give them the same good faith that you're asking for, because that answer was not it. I say, okay, yes, 800,000 babies dead a year is worse than women that had to carry those babies, being forced to carry them to term. Yes, I agree. That's worse. So what? Like you're saying, if you're wrong. But if they thought they were wrong, then they wouldn't be advocating for this fucking policy in the first place. So it's a dumb point, because in their mind, they're right. So, like, if you're wrong, it could have real bad ramifications. Okay, cool, but if I'm right, which I think I am, then it doesn't. So, cool. It's just it really has no place in this argument. And then again, that's what I'm saying. These two women represented the pro-life side very poorly for most of the debate. The woman on the left really started to make decent points toward the end when all the hostility calmed down. And yeah, so anti-legal abortion arguments that I like, and there's two of these in here. You can tell I'm probably not on this side, because I guarantee others would think there's more than two. But so as I stated above, because the representation of this argument was so bad that in the debate I watched, I was actively rooting for the pro-life side to lose. I was cheering Destiny on, hoping, and I just don't think he did it. Because at the end of the day, when the emotion died down, his argument kind of got exposed to be on shaky grounds and based on the definition of a word, and that's it. This is going to be the woman's side of the argument in that debate as well. is that the genetic blueprint exists, and if left to nature, unhindered by the hand of man, that genetic blueprint and those two cells would develop into a baby. That's the natural process. That's what nature intended, the same way nature intends death. So to ignore nature in this process and just pick out one factor, ignore potential, ignore nature, ignore what happens in time, and just cherry pick in this exact moment, it's a no, so no. I really feel like that's just a single factor bad argument that tries to boil everything down too much. And then it, again, also assumes that the factor we use to judge death should be the factor we use to judge life. And what I proved above is not just the factor, it's a factor. So one factor we use to judge death is the only factor we can use to judge personhood life. And I just don't think that argument holds up once they started to get into the specifics and started to really tear into Destiny. And again, you can watch it, but I think I covered that a little bit more above. And the other pro-life argument I think is pretty solid is killing in the product of rape. Killing the product of rape is not going to stop the unrape the woman. And we shouldn't punish the child for the crimes of the father. I feel like this stance actually sides with the Western justice system as well. We don't punish our kids in the United States. If somebody murders somebody, we don't take it out on his son legally or maybe civilly. We go after the estate, but legally we don't. So those are the arguments I like and hate. And now I'm going to do something a little different here. This is the audience response portion, arguments I'm on the fence about. Now, some of these arguments aren't really conversation winner losers. I think all of them aren't really good, like conversation winners or losers, but they're just points that need to be addressed on a practical and legal level. Also, there's some fun hypotheticals, so if this is the part you like to write in the comments, this is for you. So here's some hard questions that I haven't really been able to figure out on my own. Viability is not the same case to case, so where is the exact cutoff? This doesn't really counter the arguments of the abortion. I'm actually like wondering, where is the cutoff? Where legally, how legally would you write this law? And if that potential cutoff for viability should change with medical innovation. I don't think that the viability argument really solves all the problems that are addressed by the pro-choice side. So I don't think this would really debunk the pro-choice argument and make it so we don't need abortion anymore. But these are good questions to ask. If you are for the viability standard yourself, then you... Oh, yeah, okay, so... artificial wombs, essentially. Would you see artificial wombs making abortion illegal? And I do lean toward yes on that to a degree, but again, it doesn't address all the concerns that pro-abortion people cover in the debate. I just think it'd be a good thing, though. I feel like medically, in the future, when we're able to have artificial wombs, that would be safer for the mother. So I think that's just going to be an advancement anyways, even if it doesn't change the laws around abortion. And the second major question I have, again, it's going to be kind of like a legal, practical argument. If you extend the right to life to conception, would there be a homicide investigation for every miscarriage? I kind of alluded to this before. If women didn't know she was pregnant, she went out drinking with a baby and miscarried as a result, would she be on the hook for unintentional manslaughter? This is a similar tactic to other arguments I put down on speculating of potential difficulties in the future. So what I'm saying is this doesn't bust the argument wide open. Legislators would have to sit down and discuss this and figure out how to apply this in a fair way. I don't think it'd be it might be 5 years of legal and political discussions before this policy is hashed out. And if somebody has already kind of started that process and has some ideas, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. But this is something brought up in the 4-hour debate, actually, and Destiny brings it up like it's like a gotcha atheist checkmate point, but it is a good point. It just doesn't really debunk their argument. It's something that they just need to consider if they get their way, this is the next step. And it does need to be addressed, absolutely. So I don't really have a script moving forward, and I've already rambled off script to about 30% of my words here. But we're going to jump into our first citation. I looked through these to make sure I was right about things, but I didn't really do a lot of analysis, so you're going to kind of be going through this polling data with me for the first time. Legal under any circumstances. This is the pro-life absolutionist. Illegal in all circumstances. This is the pro-choice. I'm sorry, pro-choice absolutionist, pro-life absolutionist. Now, the pro-life camp I described is these people, but it's also some of these people. I'm going to get into that right now. So, if you ask people if they're pro-life or pro-choice, this is what they say. So, pro-choice absolutionist, pro-life absolutionist, 13%. Pro-life generally, 44%. So 31% of the country identifies as pro-life, but thinks that abortion should be legal in at least some circumstances. It's a little more nuanced than just, pro-life or pro-choice. So, this is pretty interesting too. We see actually here in 1995, we saw, and 1992 to 1995 here, anyone older than me, what was going on at this time where this happened here? But we saw a spike that's only on par with modern day thinking on abortion being legal under any circumstances. Was there some sort of push at this time in the United States between 92 and 95 for third trimester abortions, or what was going on here that resulted in this? And I'm a big reversion to the mean guy. I really think that, you averaged out these numbers, I think you get 25, 24, and legal under circumstances, you see, usually sits around 24, even though it's in the 35 range right now. Is there anything else? I guess this is a good chart we can look over here. In the first 3 months of pregnancy should be legal. 70% of the country right now thinks in the first 3 months of pregnancy you should not be able to abort, and 24 thinks no. That's weird. So 24% of the country says no, but only 13% says no in any circumstances. So I'm guessing about half the people that say abortion should be illegal in the first trimester make exceptions. But then why wouldn't they be depends? I don't know, man. I mean, Nate Silver, if you're listening, come in, Nate Silver. Help me break down this polling data, please. Oh, that's interesting. 6-point jump in repealing Roe is a good thing. That's also pretty interesting. Roe, the 58% and not over. I don't know. Just things. I find this polling data really interesting. I don't think there's anything else for the video though. So we'll get into the next one. I'll look through all this just for shits and giggles. Here, I kind of want to just talk about the ramifications. Inflation and abortion rights were driving voters to the polls. Abortion is one of the major issues. I think I actually covered that in my second citation on this topic as well. One of the major issues driving Democrats out to vote for people out to vote for Democratic politicians. I shouldn't say a lot of independents also side with Democrats on abortion. So, every victory the GOP has on this front hurts them electorally, I feel like, because of this. Where's the poll here? Where is it? This is a different poll. It kind of gives. I trust Gallup more. Real quick, Gallup does aggregates, and they take a lot of their polling data over time, whereas other polls take a snapshot in time and try to pretend. Like, you could find one poll that says 77% of the United States is in favor of Medicare for all, and then you could find a million polls that say it's around 52 to 54%. And I feel like using that 77% poll and ignoring all the rest is essentially what Destiny's doing here, with using the snapshot in time argument to ignore the bigger picture. Wow. I live in Georgia, by the way, pretty close to Atlanta. And I could say for a pretty red state, yeah, even some of the right-wing Southerners on my side are just like done with this abortion argument. They don't care that much anymore. Now, also, Democrats kind of push a little too far. I alluded to this with that Virginia bill where Northam was saying that they put the baby on the table and the parent have a conversation with the parent to decide to kill it or not, and after it's born and things like that. This is about Klobuchar saying she allows limitless abortions. Supports allowing limitations on abortions in the third trimester that don't interfere with life or health of the woman, which most of the United States does. She's lining up with the U.S. on this. They go into immediately making the argument. Oh my God, I hate this argument. So what? So what that less than 1% of abortions? Still 9,000, dude. It's over 9,000. That wasn't enough to excite Vegeta. It should be enough to excite you. But yeah, Democrats do go a little too far on this issue. They try to, not Democrats generally, the pro-choice extremist group is what I would say, goes a little too far on this particular issue. And a little bit more US-based polling. I'm trying to only get sources that line up to the left of center. ABC is only slightly to the left of center. The rest are pretty big in there. This is some state-by-state polling as well. Again, just more showing that the general pro-choice to some degree argument is pretty big. Even 10% of Republicans actually are on board with zero limitations on abortions, and 6% of Democrats are 100% against abortions. That's kind of weird. Crazy. I didn't think there was that much diversity in the party, actually, still. I feel like, especially the Democratic Party, they're really trying to force all pro-life Democrats out of the party and move them at least to the independents. All right, closing statement. Here in my closing statement, I want to address another awful argument I hear too often, but it has nothing to do with abortion. It's more smearing people who criticize one particular group more. Tim Pool is a good example of this. Tim is a left-winger. Tim is in favor of left-wing policies. He's pro-choice. He's a fan of some form of Medicare for all. He's for trans rights for adults. He's for gay rights, gay marriage, and just most Democrat policies. And he's also on board with some older Democrat policies, like 90s Democrats were huge into pro-guns and protecting free speech and blah, blah, blah. So he might not be with the today Democratic Party on guns, but he's lined up with them from 20 years ago. Yet, because he targets people on the left wing more with his critiques and his videos, he's labeled as a right-winger, despite not actually holding right-wing views. It's used right-wing in this case is used as a smear term. It's basically people on the left saying you're not allowed in the left because you don't pass our ideological purity test and or criticize us too much. It's not a good argument at all. He's still left-wing. So let's think of it this way. Is every black person that commits a violent crime against another black person a racist? I think it's like 92% of black-on-black crime. And 92% of crime against black people is black-on-black crime. And so either you're saying that black people are more racist against other black people, or what's actually happening is most crime happens to people in your neighborhoods. So, like, you rob somebody you know. I think most robberies and kidnappings are somebody you know. Things like that. Accidents. Most accidents happen within a few miles of your home. Things like that. Most things that happen to you, good or bad, happen to you around the place that you are at the most. So if Tim Pool is criticizing more left-wingers, it could mean he just hears more left-wing arguments because he's left-wing, and just by dint of being left-wing, he attracts other left-wingers to be his friends and whatnot, so he gets to hear more unrefined arguments. And this happens to me as well. So by the time I hear an argument from somebody who's pro-life, they've already run that argument through people on their side and maybe other people on my side, and I get more of a refined argument that's shed its bad points by the time I hear it. But when I could just turn left and right and talk to friends and hear all sorts of pro-choice arguments, Some of them weren't meant to leave the echo chamber. Some of them were just thoughts. Some of them weren't meant to be argued and debated. They're just how that person was feeling in the moment, and they were just an expression of their emotions. So it's easier to hear unrefined left-wing arguments being somebody on the left because those are the people I associate with. I don't want to hang out with conservative right-wingers who drink beer and watch NASCAR. I don't drink beer and watch NASCAR. I would hang out with people that probably would end up left-wing politically more often. Thus, again, I'm surrounded by more left-wing views, so that's what I'm going to hear more often, and when I disagree with them, that's what I'm going to critique more often. It's really, so to label Tim Pool as right-wing just because he hears leftists more often and disagrees with them more often is just a smear. It's nothing but a smear. I have no right to call, so the second factor here is like, how are you going to call somebody else out for their shitty policies when yours is shitty as well? How am I going to go and say that you're, hey, pro-life side, your arguments are bad, and then I turn around and my own side is using awful, dumb arguments as well? I feel like in order to go to the pro-life side, I need to clean up my house first. My house needs to be in order before I walk into your home and say you live like a slob. So that's kind of my two arguments there in defense of Tim Pool. So I hope you're leaving this video with your views exactly the same as when they came in. I hope I did not change your views on abortion at all. I want you to keep what you have. I just want you to escalate your arguments up one more step. Actually hear what the other side says. Actually close the perception gap and argue the points that they're arguing. Because even somebody like Destiny, who's able to do these things, still just missed the mark so hard on what these women were actually arguing. The woman on the left, the skinnier one, was actually arguing toward the end of the debate. She was actually making good points, and he just wasn't picking them. I think it's because he was so pissed off at that point. He probably checked out a bit. Take a moment, take a break, and show some humanity. Develop a bond with people you talk to online. I think if I start getting into debates, I want to bring up a subject that's not related to the topic. And when I start to sense the person I'm debating with is getting angry, hostile, fed up, etc., immediately switch the debate to that. Like, my favorite, what I've noticed online is you talk about boba tea. Everyone's had boba tea. What's your favorite? If you're going to go order a boba tea, what would you get right now? And that snaps people out of their anger. They're like, I get the mocha chocolate with no sugar, and then I would get double coconut jelly in it. And it's like, oh, that sounds delicious. And I tried that, and I liked it. So it was a great break from an argument that took somebody out of the anger that they were in. And it also gave me a suggestion that I now order when I go get boba tea. So, things like that. Just remind the person that you're a human on the other side as well. So, like, subscribe, all that. This is my longest video so far. If you made it here, you're a goddamn hero. See you later.